name's Soutphommasane, and I'm Race Discrimination Commissioner here at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and welcome to our Rights Talk this afternoon. Australia, does it punch above or below its weight? An appropriate time for us to be thinking about this question as we come, perhaps, to the tail end of our 2 decades long period of uninterrupted economic prosperity, at a time, of course, when Australian sporting dominance continues somewhat unabated, and at a time when we are faced with some emerging global uncertainties. And to help us go through some of these issues, we have one of the BBC's most senior and well-respected foreign correspondents, Nick Bryant. Many of you will know Nick from his time here in Australia as the BBC's Sydney correspondent. These days, Nick is the BBC's New York and United Nations correspondent. He's the author of a number of books, including most recently, The Rise and Fall of Australia, How a Great Nation Lost Its Way. Do pick it up if you haven't already. It's about to enter a reprint and offers an outsider's incisive look at how Australia has fared in recent times. But please join me in welcoming Nick to the Commission.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you.
Well, welcome back to Australia, Nick, and it's great to have you here with us.
It's fabulous to be here, and thanks for coming along in such numbers. I thought it was going to be my mother-in-law and a couple of friends today, so it's nice to have a full room to talk to. And it's great to be back. I miss Sydney more than my Sydney-starter wife, ironically. And it's always good to be back, even on a cloudy day. It's such a fabulous city. And it reminds me of why I've always called Australia the great lifestyle superpower of the world. I mean, it's such a great place to be, even on a short visit.
Well, it's great to have you back, Nick. Now, they always say never judge a book by its cover, but I'm struck, Nick, by the cover of your most recent book, because it has a picture of an apple there, and it has a somewhat rotten-looking core, and the apple's shaped a bit like Australia. Are we meant to draw a certain conclusion here, Nick? What's the central thesis of this book?
Well, I called it The Rise and Fall of Australia, not because I thought the rise and fall was something that was linear. There hadn't been a rise and fall. It struck me that during my time as a BBC correspondent here, and I came here at the fag end of the Howard years in 2006 and left almost 2 years ago. It struck me that I was reporting on the rise and fall of Australia at the same time. This was something that was happening simultaneously. Well, what do I mean by the rise? Well, you power the lifestyle superpower of the world. You have had this extraordinary period of economic growth, near on 25 years now of not having a recession. From 2000 to 2015, Japan's economy has grown 11%. America's has grown 25%. Australia's has grown 75%. And that is an economic miracle. And people like Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, have described it as such. And it's not solely down to the mining boom. You've avoided the last 3 global recessions, and 2 of those you avoided before the mining boom really kicked in a big way. So there must be something else. And it's a model that you created during your great reform era of fairly judicious regulations and some fairly carefully calibrated policy settings. We stood you in particularly good stead during the GFC. I mean, the very fact that you call it the GFC, they call it the Great Recession everywhere else, is a measure of, your banks weren't exposed to the kind of subprime crisis because they're pretty carefully regulated. The rise is seen in your culture. I mean, I think you have more cultural success internationally now than sporting success internationally now. I know you still have that terracotta urn with the ashes in it at the moment, and maybe you will at the end of this northern summer as well. But it strikes me your cultural success has been extraordinary in recent times. I mean, a great symbol of it, obviously, is someone like Kate Blanchett. She can take a Sydney theatre production of A Streetcar Named Desire to America, New York, and get rave reviews. In fact, the New Yorkers said they probably never see a finer performance. But it's a mistake to just regard the cultural success just in terms of her and her other Oscar-winning Hollywood celebrities. You see it in so many fields these days. I mean, Richard Flanagan was in New York recently. It's great to see him win the Booker Prize for such an Australian novel as well. You see it in your architects. You see it in your dancers. You see it in your musicians. This time last week, literally, on a Sunday afternoon in New York, I was at the Carnegie Hall watching the Australian Chamber Orchestra play. I mean, an orchestra looks a lot like Australia in many ways. It's a an orchestra of great racial diversity, and it's an orchestra of great musicality, an orchestra of great physicality as well. They got a standing ovation for about 6 or 7 minutes, and no wonder. They're the finest chamber orchestra in the world, but I wonder how many people know that. Anyway, that's some of the rise. What do I mean by the fall? Well, the fall has been your politics. You have had this extraordinary period of economic success and economic stability, but you've also had this extraordinary period at the same time of political instability. You've had 4 prime ministers in the last 5 years. That's more than Italy. You've had a political recession, I'd say, for the last 9 years. I always think it started midway through 2006 when Peter Costello made one of his intermittent attempts to shame John Howard into resigning. Do you remember that little note that was plucked from a wallet with a supposed succession plan? And that was Costello's latest attempt to oust Howard. And that really kicked off this period of frenzied leadership speculation on both sides. It has continued to this day. And it's not just at the federal level. I always describe Canberra as the coup capital of the democratic world. And it sounds like journalistic hyperbole, but it really isn't, because what's the alternative for that title? There isn't one. But even at the state level as well, over the last 13 years, there have been 64 changes of leadership at the state level. You know, you have seen this sort of cannibalistic fury in state and federal politics. And for the rest of the world, this is very bizarre, because they look at this and they see this multi-car pile-up, and it's made all the more inexplicable because the driving conditions seem so perfect at the time. And so that's the sort of paradox that I've tried to sort of look at in the book, and in the end decide it's not a paradox at all.
So you talk about a political recession, Nick, and you've mentioned leadership instability. Is that the only respect in which it can be considered to be a recession? No, not at all. No, I mean the leadership sort of churn is a symptom of a wider malaise, and there are all sorts of problems with Australian politics. It's a very small politics at the moment. It has been for a long time. It's an excessively oppositional politics. Elections these days seem to be won in a blaze of negativity. In some instances, oppositions just have to sit on the sidelines and wait for governments to self-destruct. There isn't the pressure on them to come up with a positive program of their own. It seems to be a very visionless politics at the moment in Australia. What seems to happen, rather than oppositions presenting a kind of program of reform to the Australian people, they tend to come up with correctives. You saw it when Tony Abbott won the election. Stop the boats, get rid of the carbon tax, get rid of the mining tax. But Kevin Rudd had a kind of similar approach as well. In 2007, he offered the correctives of ratifying the Kyoto Treaty, apologising to Indigenous Australians, and fixing work choices. But once those things had happened, what did he stand for? And I think there's a real sort of paucity of ideas and big thinking in Australian politics at the moment. I mean, you have had this great reform era that began with Hawke, continued with Keating, continued with John Howard as well. But what that has been replaced by now is a revenge era, and the politics has become incredibly nasty. I mean, you see it every day on the floor of the House of Representatives when they meet, and even fans of the Australian adversarial system have come over and seen Question Time, and they just can't believe what they're watching. I remember the first night I ever went to Canberra, I found myself sat next to a parliamentarian at a dinner after a particularly feisty Question Time. And all the way through the dinner, people were coming up to him, slapping on the back, saying, "Good on you, mate, well done." And I said to him, "What did you do today? Did you give a great speech in Parliament, or did you ask a great question that rocked the Prime Minister?" He said, "No, I got ejected from the chamber." You know, this is a system that rewards bad behaviour, and it's a very sort of municipal and small and parochial politics at the moment, I think. And it's not just the present government. I think it's been the last few governments. This is as I say, this is a political recession that predates this government. It goes back 9 or 10 years. But is this a problem confined to Australian politics and society? I mean, some would say that this is a problem that's replicated in many other liberal democracies at the moment.
Yeah, look, I think there really is a global democratic malaise at the moment. The Northern Spring has began with this sort of cloudburst of electoral politics. You've had the UK election, you've had Hillary Clinton's rollout, you've had the start of the fight for the Republican nomination, and voters seem to be still in a state of hibernation. They don't seem to be particularly enthused by a lot of the options put before them. In Britain, it's interesting that Nicola Sturgeon, who's the leader of the Scottish Nationalists, has been the undoubted star of the general election. But a lot of the others haven't really sort of cut through with the electorate. In America right now, I don't think there's any great enthusiasm for a dynastic showdown between a Bush and a Clinton. You know, two families who've occupied the White House for 20 of the last 27 years. Even on the right wing of the Republican Party, which is supposed to be the most energized part of the Republican Party, the candidacies of Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, who are the kind of Tea Party favorites, well, you know, they really haven't caught fire at the moment. So I think there is a global problem. And I think a lot of it to do is the emergence of this global political class. People who are steeped in politics, who become politicians, who have known little else. And I think there's a particular problem in Australia right now. Next week, or this week, sorry, on Thursday when Britain goes to the polls, of the 700 candidates, about 30% of them could be described as professional politicians, people who've had jobs in policy, as advisors, as aides, as spin doctors, those kind of political roles. 30% of the candidates have that kind of background. In Australia, when your parliament was elected in 2010, for the first time, a majority, over 50% of the parliamentarians could be described as professional politicians. And I think, you know, that explains a lot of the problems, because these people act in an excessively political way. They are steeped in politics. They regard everything, rather than ideological plays, there's an ideological motivation being behind it. There's a political motivation behind it, and everything is about politics. And you know, I think that's become a global phenomenon.
So how do you think we can remedy this problem then, if the professionalization of politics is at the root of these ills? How do we make politics less professional? How do we attract a different type of person to public life?
Yeah, it's a curious thing to say, isn't it, to say that politics should become more amateurish to become better. But you know, there's a lot in there. And one of the things you hope would happen is you find new pathways to encourage people to enter politics who haven't had a political past. But you know, the recent experience in Australia is that people like that are often sort of treated with great suspicion in the parties. I mean, a classic example of that is Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, an extraordinary CV that he's got. I mean, it's like a composite CV of about 7 high achievers. But partly because of that, he seems to be sort of instantly mistrusted by the party because he hasn't followed the traditional route. On the Labour side, Peter Garrett I often thought was an example of that. Somebody who was parachuted into the seat of Kingsford Smith, wasn't it? Didn't go through the normal pre-selection. And because of that, the party always resented him. And I think, you know, a bloke of obvious talent never really fulfilled his full potential because there was so much resistance from the party. You've got to try and find ways of encouraging fresh talent to come involved. Now, whether it's encouraging more primaries, I know both parties are looking at that kind of thing. Although the experience, I think, in a mayoral primary in Sydney was that the Labour candidate who emerged was probably the candidate that would have emerged in a traditional pre-selection anyway. But, you know, trying things like that. You know, Canberra does represent a big problem. It's a big part of this. I mean, it's too late now to change the location of the capital, but I think Canberra is very off-putting. It's become this political dormitory town. I mean, one of the things I was talking at the Opera House yesterday about ideas for Australia and trying to kind of come up with some fixes for Australian politics was, you know, perhaps increasing the length of parliamentary sessions, because Canberra sits for about 60 days each year, Westminster sits for 120. And what that means is that families tend to locate in Westminster. And so they have a family life, they have a hinterland. They are not surrounded by politicians. Westminster is a village, but London lives in a political dormitory town in the same way that Canberra is. They're not surrounded by politics all the time. I mean, Canberra, it seems to me, has become a very unhealthy ecosystem. And you're not going to change, you're not going to move the capital, but one thing you could do is try and change the character of the capital, and one way of doing that may be to increase the parliamentary session times. Another thing you could do to try and lower the temperature of Parliament would be to have a think about reforming question time. Again, I'm not citing Westminster as a great exemplar, because it isn't. But one thing they did in the 1950s, when Winston Churchill was in his 70s, was to cut the number of question times. It was a daily affair. It became a bi-weekly affair because they didn't want to make him sort of go to Parliament every day. They thought it was just too much for an old man. Tony Blair came in, he made it a weekly event. He turned it into a 1-hour event each week. And one of the hopes was that you'd end the Punch and Judy of British question time. And that didn't really happen. But what it did mean was that it was a short boxing match. And what Australia has at the moment is a pavement brawl that lasts a week. Britain has a short boxing match. And the ministers still face scrutiny. They appear on other days, but the temperature is lower. People aren't looking to land knockout punches on the Prime Minister. It's far more deliberative and far more businesslike. And another way, I think, of improving the quality of Australian politics might be to increase the terms of government. 3-year terms mean that short-termism is built into every decision. decisions become about winning next elections, and the next election is usually 2 years, 18 months away. It also exacerbates this kind of coup culture, because when a prime minister runs into trouble, which they inevitably do, I mean, every single prime minister has midterm doldrums, but they don't have a chance to recover in Australia. So immediately it reinforces the sort of trigger happy tendencies of the caucus. And so they have a prime minister think, oh my God, the election's in 18 months, we've got to get rid of him, we've got a new one in. And hence this kind of ridiculous churn that you've got in Australian politics at the moment.
Well, some interesting ideas there for us to ponder. Can I come back to your idea, Nick, of Australia being a lifestyle superpower and what you mean by that? You've touched on some of Australia's cultural capital as being a source of that standing. Do you think our cultural diversity is part of our superpower status when it comes to lifestyle and matters cultural?
Yeah, I've always thought that Australia is incredibly successful multiculturally, actually. It's also a country that's easy to stereotype as racist and old-fashioned on this and white. But it always struck me about coming here was this is one of the stereotypes that didn't really withstand close scrutiny. I think this is a very successful multicultural country. I mean, your population makeup, I think, has changed from 98% Anglo-Celtic. You'll know this, but Tim's written a brilliant book on all this. Don't go back to where you come from. 98%, I think, Anglo-Celtic after the war. Now, I think 45% either born abroad or parents are born abroad. I mean, that's an extraordinary demographic change. And there really hasn't been much of a backlash, I don't think, given the rapid and massive demographic change that took over this country. You know, Pauline Hanson reared her ugly head, but she was a short-lived phenomenon. And her chronology was awful. But if that's as bad as it gets, then I'd suggest that's a measure of success. You know, Britain has got a far bigger racism problem, I think. Germany's got a far bigger racism problem. America's got a far bigger racism problem. You know, I think Australia, Canada, you know, two of the world's great multicultural success stories, and I think that's definitely part of it. Yeah. You know, when I talk about the lifestyle superpower of the world, I'm also being probably a bit more frivolous, but you know, it's your food, and actually your food is a product of your wonderful multiculturalism as well. But you know, but that's a problem as well, because I think often the benefits of multiculturalism get reduced to good food, and that's ridiculous. There's so many other benefits and much more important ones. But one of the things that struck me about Australia when I was here was that Australia's long been derided as an imitative country. I mean, that was the kind of lay at the heart of Donald Horne's thesis about Australia, the lucky country. He wasn't talking about your mineral resources. He was talking about how Australia basically had a template that was ready-made. The Brits made it for you, and you kind of had a basic sort of civic structure and a governmental structure, and you know, Australians never had to think that deeply about how they were going to run the country because there was a system in place. But what struck me when I was here was that Australia isn't imitative anymore. It's become an emulative country. People want to ape your way of life. It's why people line up in Notting Hill and London to eat Bill Granger's scrambled eggs. You know, it's why hipsters in Williamsburg in New York line up outside Australian coffee shops to have flat whites brewed by Australian baristas. It's why Starbucks has just introduced a flat white. It's why London bookstores are buckling under the weight of cookbooks done by Australian chefs. I think, you know, there's no bigger indication of how people want to enjoy the Australian life than the huge numbers of people who still want to come here to live. And many of them come from my homeland. And they, I mean, especially in parts of Sydney, it seems to be a process of recolonisation is almost underway. But anyway, you know, Australia has become this society that in many respects, and there are problems with its international relations, international reputation, we can talk about those. But, you know, in terms of its lifestyle, I mean, people do regard this as, you know, the golden country.
Can I ask you more about our multiculturalism and how we do deal with our diversity? We still see from time to time incidents that are reported in public that involve racism or bigotry. How would you make sense of that on the one hand, but multicultural success on the other? Is there a sense of contradiction or paradox here?
I've always sort of thought Waleed Ali came up with a good formulation for this, which is that Australia has a high level of low-level racism. I think that's what he said. And I think that's true. There's a lot of casual racism here. I found it slightly worrying that the word "wog," I mean, if you use the word "wog" in Britain, you're automatically assumed to be a vehement racist. It's a word that we just don't use here. And I know the word has totally different connotations here. But the fact that that word, which was derogatory to begin with, was was taken on and used by immigrants themselves as a badge of identity was slightly depressing, because it you know, it was kind of trying to win acceptance on their terms rather than on terms of white Australians rather than their terms themselves. But I also think you can flip that formulation over, and I don't think there's a high level of racism. You haven't got the equivalent of an English Defence League. You haven't got the equivalent of a French far right. You haven't got the equivalent of the skinheads in Germany. I know there are, buffheads here who attack people on trains, and it's awful. But it's not organised, and it's not the brute force racism that you see in other countries, countries like America. And in that sense, and you want to combat racism wherever it rears its ugly head, but I don't think your problems are as deep as some of the other countries in the world.
Well, let's turn to America, given that's where you're based now, and you've had a chance to observe some of the civil unrest that's been unfolding in recent months in places like Baltimore, South Carolina, Ferguson, Missouri. Do you think race relations in America have deteriorated in recent times?
Well, there's a great irony here, of course, isn't there? Because you've got a black president, you had a black attorney general, and the new attorney general is black as well. So right at the top of your law enforcement system, you have black Americans. The civil rights era in America, the civil rights movement that was led by Martin Luther King, sorted out a lot of the most heinous racism in America. It ended the system of racial apartheid in the American South. There is no segregation legally enforced in America now in the South. That's what the 64 Civil Rights Act did, the 65 Voting Rights Act. And if you've seen the movie Selma, you know the background to it, really boosted voting rights. I mean, blacks in the North could vote, but a lot of blacks in the South couldn't vote. Voting officials would get black applicants, they'd give them a bar of soap, and they'd say, how many bubbles are in this bar of soap? Nobody could answer that question, so they weren't allowed to vote. The Civil Rights era sorted out segregation, it sorted out voting rights to a certain extent. What it never sorted out was the problems of the criminal justice system. And I think we're seeing those play out now. And I think many of those problems over the years have been spoken of, but never proven. And now that we live in the era of smartphones and the era where everybody can bear testimony and wield a phone to actually prove what they're seeing, and everybody's a potential news gatherer, you are seeing the emergence of these films which present incontrovertible evidence of police brutality. And that, at the moment, is really shifting the debate. One thing I would say, though, that American history, post-war history, police brutality has often been the precursor of great change. If you look at the background to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, what happened in Birmingham, Alabama, you'll remember the scenes of police Alsatian dogs chewing at the clothes of black protesters. That created a groundswell of white opinion that helped pass the 64 Civil Rights Act. What happened in Selma, Alabama, and again, if any of you've seen the movie, and I'd urge you to go and see Selma, it's terrific. Alabama state troopers beating black protesters with billy clubs created the political groundswell that LBJ could go to Congress and say, we need to pass the Civil Rights Act. Rodney King, when he was beaten by the LAPD in the early 90s, George Herbert Walker Bush was president. Again, it led to a lot of police reforms around the country. And you'd hope that this period of racial agitation and racial protest and these acts of police brutality that are being caught on camera would have a similar effect. And one practical change will probably be that most policemen in America will have to go out on patrol wearing cameras. But ideally, the debate gets broadened, not only about policing, it becomes about incarceration rates. The level of black incarceration in America is just enormous. So that debate has to happen. I don't necessarily think the race relations have got worse in America. I think the cathartic power of having a black president has probably improved them. But what it's also shown is that the symbolism of a black president in a White House built by slaves is has limits.
And does show, doesn't it, the immense difficulty of eliminating the institutional elements of prejudice and discrimination. I mean, you've studied this for many years. You wrote your doctorate on the civil rights movement in America. I mean, is it heartening to you to look at how far America has come in recent decades, or is it more dispiriting to know that the same institutional patterns of behaviour that exist today also existed in the 1960s?
Look, there are things that are positives. I mean, the fact that you've got a black president is great. The fact that you've got a black attorney general, great. The fact that you've got black police chief in Birmingham, Alabama. You know, Bull Connor, the great thug of the white supremacist movement, was the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama. Now Birmingham, Alabama, which used to be called the Johannesburg of America because it was so segregated. They wouldn't even allow black music to be played on the white radio stations. Now there's a black mayor and there's a black police chief. Baltimore has got a black mayor. You know, there are, but it shows there are, you know, and ironically, I mean, 3 of the officers that were charged, I think, in the Baltimore are African Americans. So I mean, this is not just black. You know, it's very complicated and yeah. I mean, but what depresses me about America is I find myself reporting on the same sort of things that I've been reporting on from America for the last 20 years and writing about in America for the last, you know, historically speaking, for the last 50. So it's, you know, it's kind of, you know, these things happen and a national conversation starts, but it doesn't reach the point of resolution.
Turning now to the United Nations, where you cover events for the BBC. Australia's just recently completed a 2-year term on the UN Security Council. What did Australia achieve while it was on the Security Council?
Look, it achieved quite a lot. The way that the Security Council is constructed, there are 5 permanent members: Britain, France, China, Russia, and America. They're the ones that wield the real power. There are 10 non-permanent members. They have 2-year spells. What Australia managed to do on the Security Council was to kind of make itself a temporary member plus. It wasn't a P5, but it had more influence than the other temporary members. And it took leadership on one particular issue, and it became its signature issue, and this was trying to boost humanitarian aid into Syria. And they actually achieved quite a lot. One of the big problems of getting aid into Syria is actually persuading the Syrians to allow aid to cross over the border and then to get it into these besieged neighborhoods. And Australia really worked hard on getting resolutions that would actually compel Syria to open its border. And so the fact that UN convoys have been rumbling into Syria and reaching these besieged communities where people were literally surviving by eating grass was a great Australian success. And what was interesting about it was, in order to get those resolutions through, they had to go up against the Americans. Now, you know, you don't need to know much about Australian diplomatic history to know that Australia does not often go up against the Americans. But the Americans thought that in Syria, you should focus on a political track. You should try and encourage talks, but the talks weren't going anywhere. So the Australians prosecuted the argument that said, you know, we can't let this humanitarian situation get worse while we're trying to create talks that aren't going anywhere. So actually, you know, that argument in the end resonated, and the Americans backed down, and they got these resolutions through. So Australia in New York has a very strong reputation, I think, after its 2 years on the council. But Australia, in terms of UN more broadly, is a real tale of 2 cities. In New York, there is a strong reputation, and in Geneva, where the human rights agenda gets addressed, and the UNHCR is the Refugee Council is based. Australia has a very bad reputation because of the asylum seeker issue and the boat people issue, and they're regularly criticised at a very high level with very strong language for the what is regarded as the sort of cruelty and the injustice of the offshore processing.
Can I just come back to that issue of Australia's stance with respect to the United States on Syria? Given that was atypical in many ways, does this suggest to you that there's been the development of a new style of diplomacy that Australia has used?
One of the interesting things about the way that Australia operated at the UN was like they were a team almost independent of government. They seemed to be operating on their own. It was almost as if Canberra didn't fully realise what they were up to. And I think, I mean, it was interesting, Tony Abbott came to the UN last September, and he gave a speech before the UN General Assembly, as world leaders do, and he didn't even mention Australia's humanitarian efforts in Syria. It created a sense, well, perhaps he's not fully aware of what's going on. The other thing that was noteworthy about Tony Abbott's visit last September was that it came a day after all the other international leaders had met to discuss climate change. And Tony Abbott's absence from that was really frowned upon, certainly by the top leadership in the UN and also by other member states. You know, they thought it was wrong that Australia hadn't joined in this climate summit at the prime ministerial level. It was billed as a leaders event, and you know, Tony Abbott wasn't there. And you know, Australian diplomats, I think, would tell you that, curiously, more damages to Australia's reputation at the moment than the boat people issue is the climate change issue. And I think they would think that that is you know, hampering Australian diplomacy at the moment because of the international criticism around that.
Well, how much damage has the treatment of refugees done to Australia's reputation then?
You know, it's really interesting to talk about. In Geneva, it's done big damage because you've had people like the UN's human rights chief, when he delivered his inaugural address last year, he highlighted Australia as a sort of global, you know, villain's too strong a word. I mean, you can check out the language that he used. I wouldn't want to misquote him, but he was certainly very, very critical of offshore processing. So that's in Geneva. What's quite interesting in New York is you speak to diplomats there, and it doesn't cause the problems in New York that it does in Geneva. And the bigger problem for Australian diplomacy and Australia's international reputation in New York is climate change. Yeah.
Well, interesting to hear that perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I spoke to somebody who said that only one country has ever brought up boat people with the permanent representative of Australia in New York, which is quite curious because in Geneva, that's the ongoing issue that is, you know, in the forefront a lot. But in New York, they haven't been so critical. Anyway.
No, very interesting to hear about the difference between New York and Geneva, particularly for those of us.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I should explain the way that the UN is structured. I mean, being crazy in the UN, I mean, it has two kind of vital centres. One of them is in New York and one of them is in Geneva. And the human rights stuff generally happens in Geneva, and the peace and security and stability is supposed to happen in New York. I mean, the thing about covering the UN is you often cover the inaction as much as the action. Yeah.
Well, can I ask about how you cover the UN? You've covered the US Congress, you've covered Parliament here in Australia, you've covered politics in many parts of the world. What's it like covering politics in New York at the UN?
Well, depressingly, it's quite similar because a lot of it is about negative statecraft and a lot of it is about obstructionism. And that's been the problem with Syria, of course. Getting anything through the Security Council has been so problematic because, you know, these 5 permanent members have veto power and they actually veto anything that's the Russians and the Chinese have defended at the Assad regime continually. You know, getting this humanitarian aid was a huge achievement, and the Australians were in the vanguard of it. They authored the resolution. That was a huge achievement because it was the first time that Russians hadn't raised their arm in veto. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, we talked about the global democratic malaise and the kind of negativity and the obstructionism of a lot of parliaments around the world. Well, you see it replicated at the UN level as well. And the way the UN is configured is kind of bonkers. I mean, it's a post-war construction, and it's, you know, seriously out of date. I mean, Germany doesn't have a permanent seat on the council. Japan doesn't. India doesn't. You know, these countries want serious UN reform, and you know, it's never really going to happen because obviously the vested interests won't allow it to. You know?
One more question about the UN. How do you think Ban Ki-moon's going as Secretary General?
Well, it's a feeling that he hasn't been as effectual as he could have been. Kofi Annan was quite vocal in his criticism of things. I mean, he called out the Bush administration, for instance, on Iraq and said that was an illegal war. Now, Ban Ki-moon wouldn't do that. And one of the reasons why Ban Ki-moon is the Secretary General of the UN is because he wouldn't do that. It's interesting because, I mean, there's a lot of conjecture about Kevin Rudd going for the Secretary Generalship of the United Nations. Now, he's probably the last person that a lot of people will want because he'll try and be effective in the role. And one of the things that, you know, one of the reasons why Ban Ki-moon is got a second term was because he's never really tried to get ahead of the Security Council. He's always acted with the kind of consensual support of the Security Council, and to get the consensual support of the Security Council inevitably means you have to compromise. So it's interesting that Kevin Rudd should think of himself as a future Secretary General because, you know, dynamic, high-profile, you know, controversial Secretary Generals, you know, generally don't survive.
So you see no prospect at all of there being a Secretary General Rudd?
Kevin Rudd's got a few really big problems. One, he isn't a woman, and one, he doesn't come from Eastern Europe. Now, I think those two are probably insuperable, but you never know with Kevin Rudd. But there is a kind of scenario in which that I mean, Australia's kind of in this weird grouping. It's a sort of Buggins' turn thing at the UN. You know, Asia gets a turn, Europe gets a turn, the Americas get a turn, and it is actually Europe's turn. But Australia is part of this European group at the UN. But the irony is that if an Antipodean candidate does emerge, it's probably going to be from across the Tasman, and it'll probably be Helen Clark rather than. The Brits have already said it's got to be a woman, and the Brits will veto a man. So Kevin Rudd, I don't think will be the next UN Secretary General. He won't be able to say, "I'm from Australia. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm Kevin. I'm from Australia. I'm here to help." I don't think we'll be hearing that. Don't think we'll be hearing that at the UN.
Well, I think we've got a few minutes now for questions from the floor. We'll have microphones roving. Please put your hand up if you've got a question. And we'll go to this gentleman first, and then the gentleman here, then at the back. And if you can keep your question short, please, and no comments disguised as questions. They'll be ruthless in knocking them out otherwise. Please.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
My name is Mo El-Melidi. With the election in few days' time in Britain, we have seen Ed Miliband. Perhaps he hasn't got the charisma, the same as Neil Kinnock. If you remember, in the early 80s, he's a firebrand fighting with Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher at the time. Now, I have seen Tony Blair and Ed Miliband, many people not really convinced he can take over from the current setting Tory. Here, similarity in Australia, many people not very happy with Tony Abbott, but on the other hand, not satisfied either with the current opposition leader, Bill Shorten. Do you think the left movement in both countries has moved far to the right, which most voters not really convinced any difference between both parties? It is just a matter of personality? Thank you.
No, it's a really interesting question because Ed Miliband's candidacy was based on going back to the sort of left, really. I mean, the reason he managed to beat his brother was that he managed to get the support of the union movement on board, and he made it very clear that he wasn't a Blairite. Now, his brother had been a very close advisor to Blair, and Blair was seen as the guy that moved the Labour Party to the centre and made it more conservative. And Ed Miliband was basically saying, no, I'm a more traditional kind of Labour guy. I'm true to our kind of our ideals. So.
If you look at the early 80s, in the hardcore.
Yeah, and that was the argued period where many people would have regarded Labour as unelectable. I mean, that was the whole point of the Blair project, to appeal to Middle England in a way that people like Neil Kinnock, people like Michael Foot were having real trouble breaking through. And it was a measure of how Thatcherism had changed the country in a way that. It was very hard for them to go on their sort of traditional thing, and you remember what Blair did with Clause 4, that highly symbolic moment where he rejected nationalised ownership. Thatcher changed the political geography so much that Labour leaders did have to tack towards the middle, and arguably John Howard's done the same thing here. John Howard has created moved all of Australian politics to the right. I mean, Kevin Rudd's campaign in 2007 was memorable, really, for him presenting himself as Howard Light rather than a kind of very distinct alternative.
Yes.
Hi, Nick. You mentioned about the professionalizations of politicians, and you said something like about 50% in Australia, and in UK it's 30%. Do you see the rise of our Greens here as taking it over the recent win of Jenny Leong and Jamie Parker and the one in the North Coast, can't remember? Are they able to fulfill that role? And is there any green shoots of the Green Party in Britain? I see some of my friends standing in Haringey, but obviously they don't have a chance in hell.
Well, you know that the Greens in Britain, of course, are led by an Australian,
yes.
Natalie Bennett. Look, I think the rise of the Greens here and what you're seeing globally is the fragmentation of politics. And that'll be the big story next week in Britain. Oh, sorry, I keep saying next week. It's this week, Thursday. That will be the big story. The two-party system has been shattered. And it's hard to see it ever being put back together in the same way that it was. What you're going to end up with on Thursday, I'm sure, is an inconclusive result. Nobody will win. And in future elections, it's going to be hard to kind of see one-party government anymore. I mean, it looks like Britain is going to have coalition government for a while now, or at least agreements that form a government. And the fragmentation, it seems to me, is something that's been happening here as well. You know, with the rise of the Greens, the rise of people like the Palmer United Party, there does seem to be a rejection of the two major parties. And that does seem to me to be part of a global thing and part of this same malaise.
But Miliband is not even wanting to talk to the SNP.
Well, he's saying that at the moment. Let's see what he says next week.
Or the week after.
Or the week after. Yeah, this could take weeks.
Is that a bad thing?
Sorry?
Is it a bad thing, to this gentleman's point? If there is fragmentation, is that a bad thing?
Well, it's representative, isn't it? But I think it's a symptom of malaise at the moment, that there is this rejection of politics as usual. So they're looking for new alternatives. So you get people like UKIP, you get the resurgence of something like the SNP, who were reduced to a rump, 20 years ago. They are definitely a symptom of malaise. Now, democracy is representative. If people vote for them, then that's democracy. But they're definitely a symptom of a rejection of two-party politics, I think.
Over at the back.
Yes. Continuing with your current ideas you just spoke, world over, constitutions, election systems, and parliamentary systems were designed when there was no current technology. Do you think it is time to throw away that old system and start from a fresh thing where all the people have more direct representation in decision making? Like, why only member of parliaments vote? We can conduct our bank transactions safely. Why cannot 20 million people can vote on important issue? They can discuss in parliament, but voting time, all 20 million vote. What do you think about that?
Look, if you were to, start with a blank sheet of paper, you come up with democratic systems that are probably very different than they are now. I mean, in Australia, it probably mean you wouldn't have states. I don't know. You probably wouldn't have Canberra. You probably wouldn't have a Senate that could be so obstructive. I don't know. I mean, if you were to sort of design it from scratch, you come up with something very different. I mean, I think one of the ironies, given that there has been this explosion of technology and this new level of interconnectedness. Now, you think that could bring politicians closer to the voters, but it doesn't seem to have done that. You can tweet a politician, you can contact a politician, you can be very digitally close to politicians now, but it doesn't seem to bridge what seems to me is an ever-widening gap between the political class and the populace and an electorate. So there is an irony here in this great age of interconnectedness that politicians seem even more disconnected.
You mentioned that we punching our weight above our weights on the world scene. My question is, what about in our region, in the Asian region? Are we punching above our weights culturally, socially, and I suppose economically? Are we going to be the not so white trash of Asia with the mining busts?
Right. Look, I should have begun with this actually. I hate that phrase, punching above your weight. I think Australia is punching commensurate with its weight. You're a big nation. I mean, that phrase is so belittling to yourselves that you're this kind of like bantam that's like, punching big above you. It's crazy. You're one of the biggest economies in the world. You're one of the most successful nations. And I also think that the frame of punching in diplomacy is wrong. I mean, it's far better to think about Australia being pulled in different directions on the diplomatic front. You're pulled over there for America. You're pulled over there for Britain, the old traditional ties. You're pulled over here with China. It seems to me you're kind of pulled all over the place rather than punching in different places. But let's use the phrase, are you punching in your weight regionally? I find this one hard to answer. There still is this hesitancy, I think, to regard yourself as an Asian power. I mean, isn't it ironic that when I was talking about the UN, you're in with the Eurogroup? You can put forward a candidacy. It's not Asia's turn this time, but Australia could still be feasibly the next Secretary General because you're not part of the Asian bloc at the UN. And those sort of things matter. But you have becoming, in terms of diplomatic architecture, you have becoming far more into, APEC, for instance, was an Australian initiative, wasn't it? And that's a pretty big deal. And obviously your economy is becoming far more sort of Asia-oriented than in the past. So there has been that period. But I often think that the Australia and the Asian century debate is a debate that Australia feels it has to have. It doesn't really want to have it. It's a kind of act of regional correctness almost. There's no great enthusiasm for this debate and no great enthusiasm for this reorientation. But you know, one of the reasons why it'll happen is because, you know, the reorientation of your populace, you know, you are becoming a more Asian nation, and that will inevitably impact on the regional diplomacy.
Nick, would you regard that the challenges presented by the rise of Islamophobia worldwide are quite different to the challenges which were faced during the US civil rights movement? And if so, how do you consider them to be different?
Wow, that sounds like a PhD, actually. Ask me again.
Would you regard the challenges presented by the sort of rise of worldwide as Islamophobia to be quite different to the challenges which were faced in America during the civil rights movement?
They are different. I mean, the thing that the civil rights movement was trying to sort of destroy was a legally binding, legally enforced system of racial apartheid. You know, so that's very different. They weren't only seeking to change attitudes, which is probably what you want to be doing in terms of combating Islamophobia. They were trying to change laws, and that required a sort of far greater effort. So I think there's a big historical difference there, and I mean the historical difference in America obviously is the legacy of slavery as well. I mean that doesn't act in the same way in the sort of the Islamophobia thing. But as I say, I mean that's a biggie. I'm not sure if I'm equipped to answer it.
Thanks so much for your time today, Nick. I was wondering what motivated you to pursue a career in journalism, and if you hadn't done that, what you would have done alternatively.
Well, I saw journalism as a way of prolonging my student life, actually. I like drinking coffee. I love reading newspapers, and I occasionally like writing things. And actually, that pretty much sums up the journalistic life as well as the student life. So, and it was a total lack of imagination, really. Like Tim, I mean, oddly, we went to the same university, the same college, and did the same degrees. And I kind of ran out of degrees to do, and I thought I should try and do something. I had a kind of slightly odd, after leaving sort of academia, I went to work for a British tabloid for a year, which was absolutely fascinating. But then I ended up at the BBC, which is my kind of journalistic home, and my journalistic DNA is very much BBC. But yeah, but no, it's I guess the simple answer is it's better than working. I mean, I get to fly around the world. I go to places that I really want to do. You know, we claim to have this front row seat on history, and it's a cliche, but it's true, and it's you know, it's a great privilege and honor, and it's fantastic. And it's brought me to places like Australia, which is great.
And you must have at least one war tale that you'd like to share with us based on your journalistic experience. I remember reading about a few of them in one of your previous books.
Oh, well, I was in a helicopter in northern Iraq once that got shot down. No, that's the Brian Williams story. Oh goodness me! I mean, look. One of the most remarkable things I ever covered, frankly, was the Lewinsky thing in Washington. That was just, I was talking about things on air for the BBC that your BBC traineeship just does not prepare you for. And, you know, that was interesting. And I always remember one particular instance that it was at a correspondence dinner. They had one recently, you know, where Obama gives his funny speech. Well, it was the dinner after the Lewinsky scandal, and Clinton had the bravery to come along, and there was a lot of goodwill in the room because of that. And Jay Leno was giving the speech, and Jay Leno made one Lewinsky gag, and the room booed him. But there was this great moment in the proceedings where Clinton had to deliver the award for the best scoop of the year, and that year, the best scoop of the year went to the journalist who discovered that Monica Lewinsky had kept the blue dress. So the envelope is opened, the blue dress moment comes, and this woman comes up on the stage, and Bill Clinton greets her with almost parental pride. And it was just this extraordinary moment. It was so Clintonian. But about 4 seats away, Hillary Clinton was looking at him with such daggers that you always felt that the Secret Service should start diving between the two of them. But anyway, I mean, I've seen some amazing things. I mean, I was in Kabul, for instance, when they had the first presidential election there. I mean, the sight of burqa-clad women lining up to vote, that was extraordinary. I was in, one of my first ever foreign assignments was in Israel during the just after Yitzhak Rabin had got assassinated. Now, I regard that as the second most consequential story of my life, because if Yitzhak Rabin had survived, perhaps he was the only guy that could actually do the deal. The first most consequential story was 9/11. I was in America with 9/11, and that was the moment that you realised your career would be divided in two. You'd have a pre-9/11 and a post-9/11. And to this day, the scar tissue is yet to form, because I was actually asleep in Seattle. I was a Washington correspondent at the time. I was asleep in Seattle when it happened, and it took me 4 days to get back to the East Coast. Anyway, so sometimes you miss the big stories as well.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more from the floor.
Oh, hop on to weigh in on.
Have you been following this at all, Nick?
Look, vaguely. I guess the one thing, I mean, it did get presented as a freedom of speech issue, didn't it? And I think you relinquish freedom of speech when you become a public broadcaster, to be honest. We're bound by quite tough rules about what we can say and what we aren't. I mean, every single word in this book has gone through a BBC editorial czar. Everything I've said today has gone through a kind of BBC sieve in my brain to try and make sure that it's fair and rather than being overly opinionated. So when you sign up to organisations like the BBC and SBS and ABC, certain responsibilities come with it when you speak in the public sphere.
Well, we started today with a question. Australia, do we punch above or below our weight? We now know that we punch commensurate to our weight, and that the question should not be asked. So I think we've got clear answers to the question. But Nick, as usual, so much eloquence, so much insight, always entertaining and informative. I think everyone here learned a great deal, and it's great to have you back on our shores. It was one of the fortunate things of our national life that you came to Australia to cover our.
One of the fortunate things in my life too. I was right with great affection about your land because I love it, and also the three most important people in my life are Australian, and that's my wife and 2 children, and we're raising them as Australians, and we love this country, and I dare say we'll be back before too long.
We'll see you soon then, Nick. But everyone, please join me in thanking Nick Bryant. Thank you, mate. Thanks very much.